Jamie, you're the great-great-grandson of Hudson Taylor, but how did you make your own choice about faith?
Obviously, I was born and raised into a Christian family. My parents were missionaries. My grandparents were missionaries as well. My parents served in Taiwan, so grew up in the church. They didn't have children's Sunday school back then, so had to go to church and listen to my father preach all the time. Obviously, there was a spiritual component to our family life, family prayers and reading the Bible, etc. But as is often the case with teenagers, you go through a time of rebellion, and that for me was also the case. And it really wasn't until I was 18 years old that I came to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, that I needed to be born again. I needed to accept Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord of my life. And it was really through a teacher at the school where I was studying at who took me under his wing, so to speak, and helped me come to a clearer understanding of my need for salvation. And so it was at 18 that I became a Christian. Yeah.
Knowing that you're the great-grandson of somebody that has such an important place in the church and church history, did you feel any sense of kind of pressure about the name and the heritage you were carrying?
Oh, absolutely. Growing up in Taiwan, my English name is already bad enough, James Hudson Taylor IV. My Chinese name, the literal translation of my Chinese name would be to follow in the footsteps of my ancestors. So I remember 5, 6, 7-year-old being asked, are you going to be a missionary too? Which was actually part of my rebellion, so to speak, against the Christian faith, because I just got tired of being asked that question. And so, as I describe it, for a significant period of my growing up years, the thought of, or the idea, or the knowledge of me being in this line of missionaries was actually more of a burden than it was a blessing. And it was really only after I came to faith, 18 years old, and actually even during my college years, it was still something of a burden rather than a blessing. But it was really only after, I think, I sensed God's call in my life to also go into full-time ministry that burden left, and very much now see it as a blessing, and certainly have sensed God's grace in my life as well as in the life of our family.
You're now working in the organisation that Hudson Taylor started. Were they keen to get your application?
Yeah, to say they weren't keen is not the truth, obviously. When I first applied to what is now called OMF International, which, as you mentioned, used to be the China Inland Mission, I originally applied, and they felt that I needed more Bible training. So their recommendation, rather than to be accepted immediately to be a part of this mission organization that was started by my great-great-grandfather, that I should go to seminary and get some basic Bible training, which I was happy to do. So it really wasn't a case that, they were telling me something that I chafed against. And so I went to seminary, did 3 years, and then applied again to the mission, and they said, well, okay, good, you've done your theological education. Now actually you should go serve in a church for practical experience. So they said, we won't accept your application now, but get back in touch with us in a couple of years. So it was 3 years later then that I applied, in essence, for the third time to this mission organization, and was accepted by God's grace.
We want to explore Hudson Taylor's story. What was his motivation to go to China?
Well, I think obviously it was God's work in his life. And God used probably his parents, if you read his biography. Certainly his father felt very strongly about missions, and this was back in the mid-1980s, in the 1800s, where there was a growing awareness for missions, following on the heels of William Carey going to India in 1793, and then Robert Morrison going to China in 1807. And so there was a lot of news about missions, especially in Asia, during that period of time, which intrigued his father. And his father, Hudson Taylor's father, also sensed a call to missions, but because of just some of his own restrictions, he was not able to go. But certainly that vision for mission and that passion for missions was translated into the family, because they would talk about China, they would talk about, China invented the gunpowder, China invented printing, China invented paper, etc. And so Hudson Taylor grew up within that kind of an environment where missions was very much talked about in the family. And certainly I think that was the impetus, that was the seed that was sown in his heart. And it was after his conversion that he very clearly sensed God calling him to China. So he dedicated himself to that.
When he dedicated himself to it, how did he prepare? Because it wasn't like, today I decide to go, tomorrow I'm leaving. What did he do to prepare to go to China?
Well, he was 16 years old, 16, 17 years old when he came to a realization of God's call for him to go to China. And so at that point, he had heard that medical missions was a good avenue to go into missions. And so that's what he did. And so he went and started his medical studies and saw that as a bridge to serve the Lord in China. I think in addition to that equipping, obviously he was very much involved in evangelism just within the context of where he was living. So he would go out and visit people on Sunday afternoons, Sunday evenings. He would do evangelism, he would do care among the slums, the more poor areas of London where he was doing his medical work. He certainly realized going to China was going to be a very difficult thing, just because China was not as advanced, perhaps in terms of affluence, as it was in England. And so he did away with his feathered pillow. He did away with a nice mattress on his bed. He exercised, so there was a physical awareness as well. He tried to teach himself Chinese by copying out the Gospel of Luke in Chinese, and learned probably 400, 500 characters along the way. So there was a number of things I think that he saw as critical. And certainly the whole aspect of faith and dependence upon God, a lot of that emerged out of his experience those years in medical school, and the awareness that God was faithful and God heard prayer and answered prayer. And so it was with that kind of assurance of God's presence that he went then to China to serve.
When Hudson Taylor did his missionary work, he followed a lead of someone kind of odd for a Protestant missionary, which was Matteo Ricci, did the same thing as Hudson Taylor did, which was the whole take on Chinese dress, learn the language. What was the motivation there for Hudson Taylor to act? Because that's not what missionaries did at the time, this idea of picking up the local culture.
What Hudson Taylor did somewhat differently than a lot of those early missionaries, although he was not the only one, but what he did differently is he realized that his Western clothing stood in the way of Chinese seeing this faith as something more than just a Western faith, that it wasn't a case that one more Christian, one less Chinese. And so what he did differently, and he was ostracized by the missionary community. They thought he was mad. They thought he was, a renegade. But what he did was he decided he would take off the Western clothing and he would put on Chinese clothing. He would grow a queue, and he would try to melt into his surroundings, which I think eventually proved to be the right strategy, because he was able to move around, and subsequently CIM missionaries were able to move around with a degree of freedom, especially initially where China was far more closed. They were able to move around with a degree of freedom that other missionaries wearing Western clothes, some were not able to do.
The church now is in a sense global geographically. Jesus said to go to the ends of the earth, and the motivation for Hudson Taylor and his contemporaries was taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. Now that we're sort of there geographically, what does the term "to the ends of the earth" mean to you?
Well, I think the ends of the earth could be on our very doorstep. I think of migration and the movements of people. I think what we see today is the mission field actually begins on our very doorstep. So wherever we might find ourselves, you look at Hong Kong, a city with, literally probably representatives from the 160 plus countries around the world. And so we don't necessarily have to go to Japan before we can reach the Japanese. We can reach the Japanese right here in Hong Kong. I live in Taiwan, and we have many Indonesians, workers working in Taiwan. We don't need to go to Indonesia. God's invisible hand has brought Indonesia to Taiwan. And you can go to the United States, you can go to Australia, New Zealand. Migration has brought the mission field to our very doorsteps. So I think that traditional paradigm of missions being out there somewhere needs to be broken down, and we need to realize that actually missions begins on our very doorstep, which actually is very exciting because we can mobilize the whole church. I mean, back in Hudson Taylor's day, it was only the few that could go to China, whereas now God has brought China to England, so everybody actually can be involved in missions right on our very doorstep.